what you get. Because if it's not good enough, you've done everything that the other person did, you look great. But should you be less proud of what you've accomplished? Or should you be considering the use of antibiotics? And I would say probably not. So it's a difficult conversation, and I think to give it a historical lens, I think if we go back to the pre-steroid era, it doesn't completely solve the problem. Like many of these ads that I was talking about were in the pre-steroid era. Yep. It just reduces the magnitude of potential negative consequences that can come from this pattern of thinking. The more valuable thing we can look at historically was when aesthetic competition, which is a weird thing to say.
Eric, we're going to get into that. And one of the things I couldn't help but think of, that's why some conversations need to be a certain amount of time. And I was talking about that, there's going to be that video where I discuss like a TikTok or the shortening potential of some of these conversations. I couldn't help but think, Eric, full disclosure, while you were saying that as an example, on TikTok, the mechanism with which something goes viral is that it needs to be a soundbite, it needs to be easily transmissible. So it needs to be a point that isn't too complex, that can immediately be under the average human would have in order to keep them watching or how to keep them engaged. So algorithms are designed to clips, your slower thinking part to be like, do I really want to watch that? Like as a side note there, like as a joke. It's like, I saw a video with like Larry Wheels. It's a juicy title. It's something that pops up in the feed. YouTube is calculating on the next thing based upon what you just watched, versus the Alan Kroll video, what is more likely to keep you on the platform, and it worked, right? Because we're not in the moment. Every single choice as a human.
The Matrix online.
So they've done some exploratory work down. Let's call it. And just think about the country. We weren't at a point that we could make really coherent, cohesive choices that we would be proud with long term. And then you propose a system that's designed to basically gamify your responses and give you certain things. Oh, now you see a trusted figure that you thought like, oh, this guy's pretty cool. And I find it's kind of sardonic when you think about it, that an individual who started using at 17 due to societal pressures then creates content as a 27-year-old that encourages the next generation to basically, like, let's just call thing a thing, Eric, that TRT, what you just said, 2/3 of people, you said there's 2/3, Eric, of people that don't do any tests, right?
I like aesthetics, and I saw them as separate because that's how they were presented. And like being a power builder is this new crazy idea that came out in the 2000s. Like, no, it's just called lifting weights before, the modern era, right? Like CrossFit is not revolutionary. It's a callback to the way things used to be, Anyway, so as I've studied history and I thought about what I appreciate, I found ways to blend as an interesting and fun challenge these things that have become hyper-specialized that didn't used to be, and trying to find the way that I can, have the least amount of negative downsides to that from a performance perspective as an athlete. So I think because I appreciate the artistic expression and because I'm interested in performance as well as aesthetics, and I have a competitive outlet that allows me to create a separation between myself and that, for me it's a largely positive experience, although it hasn't always been, which is the whole formation of 3D Muscle Journey, is how do we provide a community where we can nudge the needle towards hopefully this, no pun intended, nudge the needle towards this being hopefully a more positive outcome for you, or providing a community where it's totally okay if you step away from competition or from it and you're still part of the community because you lift, kind of like paradigm culture for all lifters, if that's not the pursuit because that's been negative for you, right? That whole idea of transparency and informed consent. And that's why I've written just as much about how do we optimize our protein intake as I have about how do we extreme sport. It's just like saying, yeah, of course, tackling someone in football isn't healthy, right? It needs to be seen in the same way. But I think if we're going to pursue this external idea of beauty, it should be seen kind of in the same way as like body modification. Like I want to get tattoos or earrings. It should be this empowering thing where I'm directing my own development. Or like Arnold described, a sculptor puts clay on the sides, I have to do lateral raises, that kind of deal. Like, there was some element of artistry to it, and ownership and trying to create something that is visibly pleasing because it has an artistic element to it. And I think that's why I like the posing routine, even though it's not judged, So I think if it's purely based upon the idea that I was okay with myself until I was exposed to someone telling me I was ugly or not good enough or a weakling or what have you, which some of the marketing literally, like I described, was, oh, you're having problems in life? That's because you're a weakling and you're getting sand kicked in your face and you're not going to be successful and you're going to lose your girlfriend, right? And if you want to fix that problem I just created for you that you didn't know you had, give me money and I can help you be more like the bully, right? Which is wild when you really think about the psychology underlying it. So I think, yeah, the idea that there is just, that marketing simply taps into the desires that people already have. I think it also taps into the fears that people have being able to improve. And I think if anything, exposure to actual competitive bodybuilding, not the marketing of competitive bodybuilding, creates that little more separation, you know? So it's a funny thing. But anyway, I know I've been kind of all over the place. I don't have super firm views on this. I don't know the solution. But I definitely think that those two factors, having a realistic, more progress-oriented, based upon outcome-oriented goal, and ensuring that your motivator is one that is not negative, I think are critically important so that people don't go to some place where they look back and they regret it.
To quote Eric, Chris Farley, the late great Chris Farley, in Waynesville 2, where Wayne asked him, he's a bouncer, hey Chris, like how you doing? He's like, great, life's great, life's great. He's like, I hate myself, I hate my father, I think I'm gonna go pick a fight. And then he just rushes off somewhere where it's fascinating. But yeah, the first, like a fear motivator, 100%. I couldn't help but think that I'm a beneficiary of your work as an example where I spoke to you about in 2019 the sustainable nutrition paradigm, like just simple things like the diet rates. The concept of getting into lifting, my brother was speaking, there's a cultural aspect to it where I came from a place of playing competitive sports, but here's the thing, if you just look at the injury rate per 1,000 hours, that many other competitive sports, any other sport basically is far more injurious than anything that you could do while lifting. It's actually basically a safe environment. It's a safe environment to potentially participate with your homies or with yourself, it doesn't really matter, but in the pursuit of using your body. And I think coming from a place that in some way, shape, or form, I'm experiencing like soccer, like whatever, doesn't really matter. I was always moving my body. And so that initial idea of, oh, I can do this in a controlled environment, there's easy ways to define progress, so like you're lifting and so forth, and it wasn't like, oh my God, I didn't look at myself in the mirror one day. Like a lot of things in my life there, it's extremely accidental. I was looking like gee golly, you know, one of the things actually, that's why it was, part of it was a little ego though, where I told you, I sprinted against that guy who was like the fastest kid in my high school, and I got dusted, and I was like, I am just out of shit, out of breath, and all this BS. And that was part of the impetus behind going to the gym. Because I was training with my brother, and there wasn't, we weren't exposed to anime. I want to send you some of them. Like this anime trope of like, no one believed in me, everyone abandoned me. I said I was good. I'm like, you're 19 years old. Like, no one actually hates you. Like, I'm pretty sure no one even thinks about it. Like, the worst part is no one actually even thinks about you, like in the first place. So you're unremarkable in every capacity because you're 19 years old. You know, but I couldn't help but think that environment will not give them the opportunity to think about the things that then develop the lifelong pursuit of lifting. Because I think our focus as when I say this man with our culture, and that's what that is certainly like a component of that, is that we're lifelong lifters, but we see the benefits from a health standpoint, and that's what we said about tying into health. That there's a lot to get from lifting, and a lot of it is over a long period of time, and it's not your superficial first thought of when you first start participating. It takes a while for you to discover it, and it's a personal process that you really can't like shortchange it, and someone can expose you to the right mindset, but it's something that you have to take onto yourself. You have to don the mantle, so to speak. So I just wonder, Eric, about some of the current environment and not providing that opportunity. Like you have, like you train with your friends, you're
valuable and socially influenced, but I think that that's probably one way to do it. So I am grateful that from the start, the people who did influence me, to kind of get to your point in your question, they did have this blended power building-esque kind of more holistic approach. Even though like I was interested in bodybuilding from the get-go, you know, the first competition I did was a powerlifting meet, and I was just generally interested, like I wanted to get stronger on all the things I did. The idea of progress is what became infatuating for me. So I think for someone who gets purely attached to the idea of sculpting a physique and looking better, I think that's a little probably harder to manage. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. But like, because there is going to be some degree, I think it's easier to find more opportunities when you have a broader things that you're focusing on, like adding a rep on your tricep pushdowns. But if that's not how the focus and you just want your triceps to look a certain way, division, for a long time that was all there was. You know, it was just men's bodybuilding. There was no women's competitions, or they were totally separate and they were much more like kind of beauty focused. That was, you know, that's been around since the 1900s and probably in a more, you know, format that we're accustomed to now, where there's no lifting component at all, since the, you know, 40s, 50s. But then since then, like if we just look at like the modern era, like men's physique, you know, with the board shorts and kind of looking like a fitness model, that was 2012 that got introduced. Classic bodybuilding, 2016, which is kind of saying like, look, bodybuilding has got to the point where it doesn't have the kind of appeal, and we want to make it look like more like 70s and 80s, ironically. So let's create that. You know, first Miss Olympia was 19 natural things that happen to women who weight train. They tend to be more muscular in the lower body. They tend to be a little more lower body fat dominant. So it makes quote unquote allowances for that. So I guess you could make an argument that that's, you know, a wellness category. But of course, there's a lot of women who don't fit that mold, right? So anyway, so there's been a lot of changes there, and like you see some federations don't have women's bodybuilding anymore, they just have physique, which is more or less women's bodybuilding. And there's intermediary categories between like figure and bodybuilding, like fit body, or in the divisions, or sorry, in the federations where they have both bodybuilding and physique and fit body are very similar. And women's bodybuilding has been dying for a long time, you know, unfortunately, as soon as other divisions were around. So it's a really interesting thing, and in my experience as a bodybuilding coach, when I work with people who compete in divisions that are very far from what the mainstream society expects, those tend to be the people who have, ironically, a more, I would say, centered and crystallized motivation and rationale for why they're doing what they're doing. Like, for example, women bodybuilders, in my experience as a coach, are pretty damn rock solid, despite the fact that physiologically they're undergoing more stress than a bikini competitor or a figure competitor, having to get a little bit leaner, having to diet longer. So, yeah, before you saw that video, you didn't even think that was a non-aesthetic arm. Like, what's wrong with you? So it just kind of goes to show, like, if you want to have the empowering experience of lifting weights being something where you get to focus on progress and build your own sculpture and have this, you know, idea of improving your self-efficacy and being someone who has more ownership and empowerment in life, maybe that route where you're kind of a slave to the newest, you know, YouTube channel and you're getting pitched why you should be on TRT and yes, please click my affiliate link like every 10 minutes isn't the way to go, maybe?
There. So solid. Some would say rock solid, but I'm not surprised coming from you, okay? I do, one point I want to get back to, one of the elements I miss, and I certainly appreciate, I know you do, is the expressive nature potentially of bodybuilding and the form of artistry that posing allows. I remember one of the things I personally remarked to myself when I first watched Pumping Iron was Ed Corney, was his posing. Like there's an elegance and poise to the way that he held himself that clearly was an artistic form. That's what we joke about here. But it's like, as an example, and you said, yeah, you spent 10 years trying to get your physique, or like 1 year, like whatever, like going on PEDs. It's the headline era where it's like, you don't undertake that hero's journey, you just get the end result, so you get the shortcut. It's like doing the cheat code without developing all the necessary skills, the idea that you could persevere, the understanding of yourself, testing yourself through the waters. And it's not surprising that I said this in that upcoming video about TikTok, which is like the new generation. I've literally seen in the 2 years I've basically been on, like social media, like made some content, but like more observing than participating. I've seen people, Eric, on TikTok have a meteoric rise and then fade to obscurity for many different reasons, but their physiques have mirrored
that journey, it's been a parallel to their personal journey of being a social media figure, and just how tenuous it all is, I find fascinating, because it's like the pitch that they're giving to the kids, let's say for their, in the pursuit of just looking like your aesthetic and like all the associated things that they get, it's like saying, oh, you want to eat really delicious things.
Yeah. I don't know how far that goes, or like, because I've also like, I don't want to get too big. Like I kind of, like in my era, it was, I want to look like, you know, Brad Pitt in Fight Club or something like that, or was it Snatch or whatever, or they wanted to look like, but it's always like, there was often I don't want to get too big, I don't want to be too muscular. Like there was the goals weren't too unrealistic, you know, to be honest, right? It was just like, I want to have abs, and you know, and just whatever level I need to get to and the work I need to put in to be attracted to the other sex that I'm interested in, if that's the way they leaned, or the same sex, whatever way they leaned, then that's what I want.
Yeah.
And that I think is entirely understandable, totally reasonable, and probably everyone who's lifted weights who is, you know, sexually interested has had that go through their head at some point. Maybe, I could be wrong. It did go through mine, although it wasn't the main motivator for sure.
Yeah.
But I think beyond that surface level thing, how often do you think people are actually like putting connecting the dots, or do you think it's a little more subconscious? Yes, like all this, yeah.
Right.
I didn't like the things I would have to do to become like quote unquote popular, but you know, I was a late bloomer to many things. but yeah, it's just like I don't think a lot of people really think it through, but it is still a very strong motivator. Like if you look at the things that kids do that are really fucking mean sometimes, you know, or the experiences that many of us have had at various times, that in the pursuit of finding how do I become socially accepted, they're strong motivators, even though that people can't articulate what exactly it is they're chasing. So I don't think you're wrong there.
I think so. We're always 2 steps away of the Lord of the Flies moment, okay? Like in any like Piggy, like on that deserted island, I am acutely aware of it. I will say very quickly that we're talking about this concept, and I love what you brought up about the goal of 3MJ. I think one thing that we do have to discuss that applies to all pursuits, and that's why you talked about the concept of informed consent. I joke a lot about powerlifting, because some of the spaces that I operate and I've inhabited are older places for powerlifting, meaning it's not the new crop, like more IPF oriented lifter. And as an example, if you wanted to participate in the culture of strength in the 90s, there were certain aspects of the methodology that would be disastrous for your body. And it's not like you look back and look at like your coach is Coach Bob, I can't believe he did that to me, where like, you know, you like squat every day, or like you basically do things that are not conducive for longevity. And you do see the like old school powerlifters, like a lot of them are kind of beat up because of what they did to try and get strong. They didn't know any better. These things weren't systemized. They weren't openly discussed. And I think one of the things, and so I think it's natural, because like you said, Eric, I do think in terms of why we do what we do, which should be always a pause at some inevitable point, is not only super necessary, but it's invaluable when we talk about the concept of trying to pass on. And I do, like, most things, Eric, that I talk about, I'm a shit disturber, and I would say I'm cynical and I'm irreverent in nature, but not in a way where the intended consequence is a negative one. It's more, it's fun, because the idea is it's very punk, like just to spit in someone's face, like call bullshit when you see it, not hopefully hold yourself on a pedestal, but I do hope some of this, part of my hope of these conversations is that when we are gone, like who knows what will happen, not like the legacy, I'm not talking about that, but everything contributes to one another to either push the ball forward or reverse it. And I have seen, and that's one thing I'll say maybe in closing it, I have no doubt, like, think how much you've influenced me, like the work that you've done, and then by proxy of that, like what I put out, like that connected chain, right? This is not even a joke. There was someone I was filming, that's why I told you, I'm not trying to make this about me, but this is just an example. But there was a dude, we're filming with my man Walter, we're filming by the river, the one that the TikTok video, and there was a guy, so he was driving a bus, and because it's all this special commission
in a row. And Nick is his name. He pulled over and he got out, but like just the conversation that we had, and I could tell like it's the through chain Eric Ball of things. Like basically now he's like pursuing like strength, and like this and that, like his eating habits, like how did that? I am the conduit of these ideas, but I am not the originator of the slightest. Like, I have been connected to all these things. And if we just think from the perspective of that interaction with Nick, how you know it's had absolutely positive impact on his life, training, and his overall outlook, and so on and so forth. That words do what we discuss.
You know, when they don't actually acknowledge that there are neutral, positive, and negative aspects of society, and without actually thinking like, well, how can we make it better, and what's realistic, and what's a pathway forward, you know? I think, I'm not saying like all protest of society is bad. Of course that's a necessary component to it. But I think there's a lot of people who will just simply deconstruct things and point out problems and sound very intellectual doing it. They may even be right, but it's very one-sided and it's very rarely solution-oriented. And this is one of those things where the only way I can feel comfortable personally in this space and think about aesthetics and competitive bodybuilding and be on social media and be someone who displays my physique is to really think about this and make sure that, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not having a negative impact, because it's easy to do it. And I hope that if content creators, like you said, holding yourself and others to certain standards, if content creators hold themselves to a certain standard and have an element of transparency and talk about these things, then it will at least encourage that space to give yourself pause, to consider your actions and the decisions you make, so that it doesn't happen so rapidly and subconsciously at such a young age that you didn't really have as much agency as you hoped, even though it felt like you were making a decision, and you're not looking back with regret on where you were. So anyway, I think that's all I got to say on this topic, if I'm honest with you, Omar. And I applaud the listener who's made it this far, because we have been maybe a little all over the show on this show, but I do think we've talked about some very important things in my opinion. And like I said at the very start, this is not the end of this conversation, and I really do want to make sure